Who should be a DIY homebuyer? Now, of course, as the creator of the DIY Homebuyer Academy, it would be easy for me to say I think everybody should be a DIY homebuyer, but candidly, that would be disingenuous. Because while I believe that DIY home buying is right for a lot of people, I actually don't believe that it's for everybody. So in this video, I want to give you the framework that I use to help you think through if DIY is the right fit, or based on your situation, if it might actually make more sense to hire an agent to help with at least some of your home buying process. The goal here isn't to tell you what you should or shouldn't do, but as with everything that I do, the goal is to help you think clearly so that you can make good decisions for yourself. If you're new here, my name is Nick. I am both a licensed realtor in Washington State and the creator of the DIY Homebuyer Academy. Would love for you to subscribe, like this video. I love reading through and responding to comments. So if there's anything here that resonates with you, please do engage with me and with the channel. But let's go ahead and dive into this question of who is DIY home buying right for? And I want to actually start with just saying why this question even matters right now. And that's because since August of 2024, home buyers have had to sign buyer agency agreements whenever they enlist the help of a buyer agent. And what these agreements do is they mean that buyers are on the hook for their buyer agent's compensation. And usually this is to the tune of 2 to 3% of the purchase price of a home. So on an $800,000 home, that could be a $24,000 bill that you're on the hook for. And many buyer agents will rightly say that, well, the sellers in our market are still willing to pay buyer agent compensation, usually of up to 3%. But just because a seller is willing to pay that compensation doesn't mean that they're just doing it out of the generosity of their heart. No, they're baking that compensation in to the sales price of the home. And therefore, if you can represent yourself and potentially save the seller from needing to pay that $24,000 or whatever it is that they were planning on paying a buyer's agent, well, that gives you a lot more leverage in negotiation and the real possibility of realizing that 3% or so as savings, whether purchase price reduction on the house or closing cost credits or something along those lines, which is why more and more people are thinking of, well, what are my options? Do I have to hire a buyer agent, or what can I do to potentially represent myself? And that's exactly why DIY Homebuyer channel exists, and because I want you to know what all of your options are. So when thinking through the framework of whether or not you should represent yourself, there's really 4 components that I want people to consider. 1 is your time and availability. 2 is your emotional regulation and tolerance for risk. 3 is the deal complexity. And 4 simply just comes down to judgment. So let's start with number 1, time and availability. A lot of people underestimate the amount of time that goes into home buying. Now, certainly there are the lost hours of just scrolling through Zillow or Redfin and favoriting listings and seeing what's available. I think we all know what it's like to get caught in that vortex, myself included. But then once you find something on Zillow that you want to see, well, now you've got even more time of communication to coordinate a showing, driving to the property, spending 30, 45 minutes, an hour touring the property, considering it afterwards, debriefing, coming up with good questions, researching the property further, maybe making another trip back. And you do this for potentially 5, 6, 7, maybe even more properties. Before you know it, you're easily 30 hours into just searching for a home itself. And then throughout the real estate transaction, there are a lot of back and forth communications. communications with the sellers or their listing agent, communications with lenders and the title company, and tracking down insurance, inspections, attending the inspection. All of a sudden you realize, whew, these hours not only begin adding up, but a lot of these communications are very time sensitive, and they come with hefty documents to review, like spending time going through a HOA and CCNRs line by line, or checking the financials of an HOA. And so I don't want people who are DIY buyers to underestimate the amount of time that is required. I don't want to overstate it either, but you should know that if you are going to take on the home buying process yourself, that you're going to need to have some margin in your schedule. It's easy to become really stressed and overwhelmed by the amount of time that's required to successfully buy a home. Now, the trade-off can absolutely be worth it, because if you have the time to DIY the home buying process, well, you can save yourself tens of thousands of dollars, right? So it is back to the question of how much is your time worth to you? But that is one of the key questions on whether you should represent yourself versus whether you should hire it out. You should really think through, okay, what would be the cost of having a buyer agent relative to the amount of time that having an agent would save me? Now, even if you have an agent, there's still a lot of time and effort required of you as a buyer, because your agent can't do everything for you. And because most home buyers like to be part of the home inspection, they like to attend all of the showings. Most buyers want to be part of those conversations. So while the agent may take some of the communications off of your plate and may help a lot with organization, they're not going to eliminate all of the time that you're going to need to spend on the home buying process. But it is still a factor to just consider, that if you're really time strapped and your time is more valuable to you than the potential savings that you'd have as a DIY buyer, well, that might move the needle towards hiring representation. But if you say, yeah, it's worth it for me to take on the extra time commitments and responsibilities of representing myself in exchange for saving tens of thousands of dollars, then great. We're off to a good start of being able to confidently say that, yeah, DIY home buying is probably right for you. Now, let's move on to the second piece of the framework, which can definitely be a little bit more touchy and certainly requires that you have some degree of self-awareness. This has to do with emotional regulation and your tolerance for risk. I think this is a truism throughout all of life, but markets punish panic. And that's very true of the housing market as well. In fact, there are so many stories of buyers in 2020 and 2021 who, because interest rates were low and housing supply was also at historic lows, buyers panicked and they way overbid on homes that now they feel like they're totally locked into, because the homes didn't appreciate in ways that they were expecting. Interest rates have gone super high, and there's a lot of buyer's remorse in the market. And many of these people had agents on their side. So again, it's not like having an agent is necessarily going to save you from making panicked decisions. But it is something that as a DIY buyer, you have to be very aware of. If you feel like you are a highly emotionally reactive person, well, that can be very, very dangerous for you as a DIY buyer, because you can make housing decisions based upon headlines that are ever changing, as opposed to being calm, cool, collected, well-reasoned, making decisions that you don't regret for the long run. Now, buying a home can be an incredibly emotional journey, because especially when you're buying a primary residence, most people aren't just looking for a house as a commodity. They're looking for a place that truly is home, something that they feel is an extension of their own personality and lifestyle, which I get that. But because of that, the emotional stakes feel higher. And usually the art goes something like this, where you get a real emotional high of falling in love with a place. And then you start to take a dip as you have to go through negotiations. Finally, you get it under contract, and then you have another emotional high. And then you start going through inspections where you can have another dip based upon seeing flaws in the home. There can be another serious dip when it comes to underwriting and financing and looking at hard numbers about just how expensive the house is going to be. But then you swallow all of that and decide to move forward. And then you have the huge emotional payoff of when you actually get keys to the house. But there's a lot of ups and downs, a lot of uncertainty in there. And for some people, I can just feel like, this is too much to handle on my own. And so this is a caution that I have to would-be DIY home buyers is just, all right, how do you do with all of those emotional ups and downs? And how well do you do with being able to walk away from something that might not be in your best interest long term? Because again, with falling in love with a house, it's both beautiful, but it can be a very dangerous thing if ultimately the house is just not a good move financially. Of course, this is why I think what I offer with DIY homebuyer coaching is such a valuable asset for many folks, because you're able to get some emotional grounding guidance, somebody to help push back on your emotions and just help sanity check your decisions. It's one of the biggest things that I do for the folks that I work with. And frankly, even as an agent, it's one of the areas where I can be most helpful. I play part-time real estate agent and part-time counselor. And especially when there are couples making decisions, and couples can sometimes be divided on what's most important to them. Who would have ever thought? I can even play marriage counselor. But the biggest difference between being a DIY homebuyer and having an agent is that at the end of the day, as a DIY buyer, you are 100% responsible for the decisions that you make. If you love taking responsibility for your decisions and find great personal satisfaction in that, then absolutely DIY is the way to go. Cynically stated, if you like having a fall guy or somebody else that you can blame for potential bad decision making, well, an agent can often be that punching bag, and fortunately they have error and omissions coverage that you could potentially even come after if you truly felt you were misguided. So I want to be candid and upfront just about what the risks are by being a DIY buyer. Now, again, it comes back to the savings of that you could potentially save tens of thousands of dollars by representing yourself, by not having to pay that to a buyer agent. But what's your tolerance for risk? Is that trade-off worth it to you? Again, for many people it is, but not for everybody. The third piece of the framework is deal complexity. Not all real estate transactions are created equal. Some are much more complex than others. I find that the majority of the DIY home buyers that I work with, they're buying homes that are in pretty standard subdivisions. And this is great because in a subdivision, there's usually much higher volume of recent transactions, which makes it way easier to find comparable properties and therefore establish what a fair market price for a home is. There's usually much clearer title records. There's hardly ever any questions about lot lines or encroachments. And things are just much more straightforward when you're buying a subdivision style home. Now, these can be really high end, really expensive homes, but it's generally not as complex when you're buying a home in a neighborhood or new construction where it's just a more standardized process. Where it gets a lot more complicated is when a property is super unique. If you're buying a lot of land, if you're buying something that has a bunch of outbuildings, if you're buying a property that is both for your residents as well as you have business goals, commercial uses for the property, or just anything where it's not a lot of comparable sales in the last 6 to 12 months, becomes much more difficult to peg what is the fair market value becomes more difficult to negotiate. In those cases, too, there can be more contingencies that are required, especially on land, because there's more things we need to consider, like if there's a well or septic and the condition of those systems, surveying of the lot lines, looking into any sort of leased equipment or what's actually happening on the property, if there's risks of it being in a flood zone, fire, all of those sort of environmental hazards that are just less clear the more unique a property is. Basically, the way of thinking about this, right, is that for the vast majority of Americans, TurboTax is a perfectly fine service. I would say most people don't need to have their own CPA in order to successfully file their taxes. But there are a lot of folks that have unique situations because of businesses that they own or strange sources of income that it's well worth paying the additional costs of having a tax professional because they're going to be able to find ways to ultimately save you more money and, just as importantly, protect you from audits. It's the same kind of way that I would think about real estate representation, is that if you're buying a pretty standard, straightforward home, you can expect that it's going to be a standard, straightforward transaction. But the further you get away from those subdivisions where things are transacted all the time into more and more unique territory, well, the more risk you have, both in terms of deal complexity as well as potential gotchas associated with the property. Therefore, the more valuable having representation actually becomes. Now, of course, I work with DIY buyers one-on-one, no matter what kind of property they're looking at. But this is one of the things that in an initial consultation, I talk with people about is, hey, this is a pretty complex deal. Are you sure you don't want somebody who's actually local and has more knowledge about these particular property types than I do sitting in Washington State? But deal complexity is a big one. And if you want some feedback on just, okay, is this too complex for most DIY buyers? Well, let me know, shoot me an email, and we can talk about it. The fourth and final piece of the framework simply comes down to judgment. And judgment is distinct from knowledge. Now, knowledge is easy to come by, especially in the days of ChatGPT and all the AI tools available to us. Knowledge is not hard to obtain, but judgment, knowing what to do with that knowledge and how to make good decisions, that's really the thing that will either make you or break you throughout the home buying process. So DIY buyers, all of that judgment comes back to you. It can be a really rewarding thing to be in charge of making good decisions, but it can also be a big responsibility to bear, especially when you're talking about homes that are 7, 8, 900,000, $1 million plus. I mean, that's a lot of potential risk to take on. This is where I find that I can be really helpful to DIY buyers, is helping you determine things like your walkaway number, helping you make sense on an inspection report. What are the things that are big and legitimate concerns versus what are the things that they sound scary, but they're actually not? And also, how do you leverage the seller's motivation and condition of the property and your own strengths and weaknesses that you bring to a transaction? How do you leverage all of that to get you the very best possible deal and terms? How do you hold a transaction together when it feels like it may be falling apart, even though you want to find a way for it to proceed? This is where a lot of DIY buyers can get really tripped up because they assume that it's going to be much easier than it actually is to make good decisions. But these decisions can become very consequential very quickly. And for some folks, they determine, you know what? It's really just worth it to have an agent on my side, even if it comes at the high cost, because they're going to help save me from a very, very expensive decision, as well as potentially save me a few $1,000s in negotiating a better deal. And yeah, that might come at a hefty expense of $20,000+ being added in transaction fees paid out in agent commissions. But if that 20 grand saves you from making a $500,000 mistake, most people would say that's money well spent. Again, that being said, though, a lot of you have the kind of judgment that you need, the sort of fortitude to make good decisions, to know your walkaway number, to actually be able to walk away, such that, again, saving that $20,000 plus is a real difference maker in you getting into a home that you actually love and want versus potentially missing out on those homes or paying more than you need to for them. But again, that's ultimately up for you to determine, judgment term again, but between whether or not you need somebody who is full service, full time on your side, hand holding you through every step of the transaction versus just somebody that you can consult with at the most critical moments to stress test your ideas and assumptions. So that's the 4-step framework for deciding whether or not DIY home buying is right for you versus hiring an agent. Before I end the video, though, let me just give you a couple quick hits on some of the biggest mistakes that I see DIY home buyers make. The first one is that there are some unrepresented buyers who just approach the home buying process with an arrogance, or at least way overconfident. They don't expect how much time it's going to take, and they don't prioritize urgency in communications. Once you're in contract on a home, the time is of an essence clause is very real. And if you miss contractual deadlines, those things are not forgiving. You don't get do-overs in those moments. And I see that arrogance and overconfidence in some unrepresented buyers become a major disservice to them that costs them thousands of dollars because they missed a contingency deadline or because they thought that they were much more emotionally regulated than they actually are. And they made a very quick, panicked decision that they end up regretting later. So on the flip side, one of the biggest markers of success among DIY home buyers is a degree of humility that says, yeah, while I don't need a full service agent to represent me, I'm also aware that there are things that I don't know and would like to have at least some guidance or somebody in my corner throughout this process. Number 2 is that I see some unrepresented buyers underestimate the importance of inspections, which you really do at your own peril. Now, I get it that not all inspectors are created equal, and there are some inspectors that do a bad job and they just miss things. But if you find a good inspector and they uncover issues with the home, I mean, that can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars by letting you know you need to walk away. But also, those inspection reports, like, don't just throw that away after you buy the house. Let that inspection report be a guide for you to know what needs to be maintained, what you need to budget for moving forward. Yes, they are $500, $600, $700 for an inspection, but if you implement the findings there, I mean, you're able to, one, often leverage that report to negotiate thousands of dollars off of the house, or thousands of dollars worth of repairs. And then you're also able to use that report to plan for preventative maintenance that will save you potentially tens of thousands of dollars, or at least put some of those major expenses off as long as possible. The third mistake I see unrepresented buyers make is that they are trying to save money everywhere, and therefore they don't spend strategically. This kind of comes back to skimping on home inspections. But the goal for a DIY buyer is not to be cheap, it's to be financially efficient. And there is a big difference between those two things. And I think that home buyers who approach the home buying transaction and just want to be as cheap as possible about it actually end up making really big mistakes, whether that's overpaying for a home, missing big things contractually, missing out on big things in the inspections, stuff that, yeah, they saved a few bucks up front, but they're losing tens of thousands of dollars over the next few years because they just didn't know what they didn't know and weren't willing to pay to find out. And the fourth mistake that I see unrepresented buyers make is thinking that DIY home buying is inherently anti-agent. And it's not. DIY home buyers and agents need to coexist together in the world. In fact, they are dependent upon one another. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions that I need to correct often, is that I am not anti-agent. I am a real estate agent. And I believe in the power of DIY homebuyer education because I think that DIY homebuyers should be taken seriously and that is a real legitimate way to participate in the housing market, and that anybody who wants to represent themselves should be given a fair shake to do so. But I also believe that DIY homebuyers who are educated are going to make for better and smoother transactions for sellers and their agents. So everybody wins when we have an educated consumer. So yes, I do think that there are bad acting agents who are unfairly discriminatory towards self-represented DIY homebuyers. And that is a real problem. So I am very opposed to those people. But I don't think that's actually the majority of agents. I think the majority of agents out there are people who are wanting to do good, honest work, represent their sellers to the best of their ability. And I think for us to actually get along and to get good deals done, there needs to be a mutual respect that agents have for serious and educated DIY home buyers, and that buyers reciprocate to those agents, showing them respect for the work and the profession that they're in. Once we start to treat each other with disrespect, everything just falls apart. And I'm not about that. So who is DIY buying for? Well, you probably picked it up in there. It's for people who are confident and competent enough to handle a transaction as big as buying a home, but that also have the intellectual humility to know that they don't know everything there is to know, and therefore they're willing to slow down and think carefully and not be overdriven by their emotions when it comes to decision making. They're people who have time and composure, and they're willing to put more time into the home buying process in exchange for the savings that they receive by not having an agent. And it's for people who are very happy to take full responsibility for the home buying process, that they're not looking to delegate all of it off onto somebody else, but they enjoy the personal satisfaction of being able to say, yeah, I did that. Of course, with some guidance, some hired judgment at critical moments. I think that's a really good thing. And certainly the clients that I have worked with have found it to be like a no-brainer sort of trade-off, the hourly fee that they pay me in exchange for the savings that they have received in their home buying process. But whether you choose to work with me or not, knowing that as a DIY buyer, you're taking on the full responsibility. That is, I think, the biggest tell at the end of the day of if you're comfortable with that, then absolutely, DIY is a phenomenal way to go. DIY home buying, it's not about being cheap. It's about choosing the right level of service you need for your unique situation. And again, it's not for everybody. And so if you watch this video and you conclude, that is not for me, well, that's totally fine. And if you're in Washington, shoot, let's work together. And I can represent you with more service than what's offered in the DIY Homebuyer Academy. Or if you want help getting connected with a good agent, that's also something that I am absolutely happy to do. But if you're somebody who watches this and right now you're just fired up about taking on the home buying process on your own, man, do it. Get after it. And I'm here to help support however I possibly can. So let me know what you're thinking down in the comments below. One more reminder to please like, subscribe to the channel, share this with somebody who you know that's thinking about buying a home. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.